Victor's credit denial was just the latest in a series of humiliations driven by racism disguised as professionalism. A man with vision, he was once again crushed by the system. But he knew how to respond. Harsh, precise, and unforgettable. What he did next will shock even the most seasoned. But let's start from the beginning. Viktor Johnson had spent months tirelessly trying to secure the loan that would finally turn his dream into reality. A dream that had burned within him for years. A dream of owning his own business, free from the constraints of a system that had consistently overlooked him. With a sharp mind, a proven track record, and a determination that refused to die, he knew he was ready. Yet every rejection, every no, felt like another layer of weight pressing down on him. But this time was supposed to be different. This time, he had an audience with Thomas Grant, a banker infamous for his cold efficiency and unshakable control over wealth. Victor entered the sterile, minimalist office, sitting across from Grant's polished oak desk, his fingers lightly resting on the arms of the chair. He had prepared for this moment, like a soldier gearing up for battle. His business plan was meticulous, every detail accounted for, every risk evaluated. But as Grant settled into his chair, adjusting his tie with a lazy, almost theatrical air of superiority, he didn't even glance at the proposal. Instead, his gaze remained locked on Victor with a chill that made the room feel colder. "I'm sorry, Mr. Johnson," Grant said, his voice smooth, almost disinterested. "The bank doesn't lend money to people like you. You're not a proven investor, and right now, we're not taking on any risks." Victor felt the words slam into him, a gut punch that left him momentarily breathless. His chest tightened, blood pounding in his ears. His fists clenched under the table, nails digging into his palms, but he forced a smile, a tight, controlled thing that didn't reach his eyes. "What do you mean, people like me?" he asked, keeping his voice steady despite the fire building inside. Grant's expression didn't flicker. "People with your background, your race. There are limits to what banks can afford to do." The words landed with a brutal finality. They weren't just a rejection. They were the harshest reminder that Victor had spent his life fighting against forces much bigger than himself. Every door closed, every obstacle thrown in his way, had led him to this moment, a moment where the system had made it clear. No matter how hard he worked, no matter how high he reached, there were walls he could never scale. Victor didn't return home defeated that day. Instead, as he walked out of the bank, his mind burned with a singular thought: revenge. But this wasn't the kind of petty vendetta that consumed the weak. No, this was the culmination of years of quiet scheming, of deliberate, patient preparation. The time had finally come to take what had been so unjustly denied to him, and he would do it in a way that would leave no doubt about who was in control. 3 weeks later, Thomas Grant walked into his office, just as he had done for years, early in the morning, when the world was still half dreaming. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the glass facade of the bank, reflecting the cold, rigid lines of the building, as if mirroring the banker's own stiff, almost robotic posture. But today was different. There was an undercurrent in the air, something strange, an anticipation that Grant couldn't place. The usual hum of office activity, the busy chatter, was subdued, hushed almost to reverence. It was as though something significant was on the verge of happening. Grant moved toward his office, his footsteps echoing unnervingly in the stillness. When he reached the door, he paused, his hand hovering near the handle. It was wide open. The lights were on, casting harsh illumination over the immaculate interior. And there, sitting comfortably in his chair, his feet propped up, was Viktor Johnson. Grant's heart skipped a beat, and his stomach turned to ice. For a moment, he froze, rooted to the spot, unable to move. Victor's eyes met his, and the smile that spread across his face was sharp, predatory, an unmistakable grin that sent a shiver crawling down Grant's spine. "Mr. Grant," Victor said, his voice smooth, but carrying an edge that could cut glass. "I hope you don't mind, but I've decided to become a part owner of this institution." Grant's face drained of color. His gaze snapped to the desk, where the paperwork lay. The name on the deed was unmistakable, the signature bold and confident. Victor hadn't just bought a piece of the bank. He had taken it all. The very institution that had rejected him, that had tried to bury him under the weight of prejudice, was now in his hands. Grant was no longer the one in control. He was the one on the outside looking in. Victor rose from the chair as Grant slowly approached, his steps faltering, each one heavier than the last. The disbelief was clear in Grant's eyes, his breath shallow, as if trying to wrap his mind around what had just happened. "You bought the bank? How? How is that even possible?" His voice was thick with confusion and frustration. Victor didn't rush to answer, instead leaning forward, his calm demeanor belying the fire that burned behind his eyes. The stillness in the room was suffocating, as if the air itself was holding its breath. "I took my savings," he began, his voice steady, "partnered with a few others. People who were tired of watching men like me get turned away by institutions like yours. We invested in this very bank. I guess you could say, now, I'm the one calling the shots." Grant's face darkened, his lips curling into a tight, angry line. For the first time in his life, a wave of vulnerability washed over him. One he couldn't shake, one that felt alien and terrifying. "You can't just walk in here and take over," he growled, his words shaky with rising panic. "I've worked my entire life to be in charge." Victor didn't flinch, didn't even blink. He stood there, as solid as the desk Grant had once considered his domain. "Funny," Victor said, his voice a low, dangerous murmur. "That's exactly what you told me when I needed a loan. That people like me would never be good enough for your bank. Well, now it's your turn to feel what it's like when someone else calls the shots." The room seemed to close in on Grant, suffocating him. His chest tightened, his mind racing in circles, but none of it mattered. The weight of the humiliation was unbearable. The control he'd fought for, the power he had clung to for so many years, had been ripped from him in a single moment. It was a cruel, bitter irony, and the sting of it was sharper than anything he had ever known. Victor's next move was as decisive as it was public. Grant found himself standing in front of a room full of employees, his personal belongings packed and placed on his desk, a humiliating display of his fall from grace. "We can all agree that I've given this company everything," Grant said, voice shaking with anger, his arrogance crumbling. "You can't just do this to me." Victor didn't hesitate. "You had no problem doing it to me, Mr. Grant. I'm just returning the favor." Grant's protests fell on deaf ears as the employees watched, some with satisfaction, others in stunned silence. As Victor made the final announcement, the walls of the once pristine bank felt as though they were closing in on Grant. "Effective immediately, Thomas Grant is no longer with this institution. I trust you will all continue to serve our clients with the same dedication, but with a new perspective on fairness." For the first time, Victor smiled with satisfaction, not because of the power he held, but because justice, in its own way, had been served.